Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and all of our non-binary folks out there. It is once again that time of the week. What time of the week is it? Well, it's that time of the week where we dig underneath the headlines, where we examine what is really going on, dig underneath all of that capitalist propaganda, and talk about what's really going down. We bring you news at the local and international level, talk about activism, left-wing politics, and all matter of stuff in between, and generally call out the establishment on its BS. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. Now, as always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 FM WIDR Kalamazoo or Western Michigan University. So, while we're waiting for the co-hosts who boast the most political roasts, as it were, I wanted to talk about a local story. Not necessarily Kalamazoo local, but up in Grand Rapids, having to do with some comrades up there who recently got themselves in a bit of a legal pickle. This was part of the anti-ICE protests that they were doing up in GR, but several protesters got arrested. And I want to talk about this because as somebody who has also literally been arrested for just about the same thing, I wanted to compare, contrast, and maybe offer a little bit of commentary on this article right here. So, headline is 7 arrested in anti-ICE protest face 93 days in jail. Wow, that's a lot. So, I'll read a little bit from the article and then talk a little bit about it. So, 7 protesters arrested during an immigration rally last week pleaded not guilty Friday morning to a 93-day misdemeanor. By the way, this article's from July 6th, so a little under a week ago. The 7 were arraigned on Friday, July 6th, on one count of failing or refusing to obey a police officer's lawful command. The misdemeanor is punishable by up to 93 days in jail and or a $500 fine. The charge stems from a June 28th protest against Kent County's contract with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, if you were listening to the show last week, we were actually interviewing one of the Movimiento Cosecha organizers up in Grand Rapids about a protest they did at the July 4th parade. This is something that took place about a week or so before that, and talks a little bit more about this. That day, organizers shut down a Kent County Commission board meeting and then marched through the streets. 7 among the group of about 100 were arrested by Grand Rapids police after sitting in the roadway on Michigan Street Northwest at Ottawa Avenue. One of the arrestees, Carpenter Lugs, speaking after her arraignment, said the act was to show solidarity with immigrant families being separated at the border and in Kent County. This is an act of civil disobedience, Carpenter said. There are cities and counties all over the U.S. who are ending their contracts with ICE, and we want Kent County to do the same. We want commissioners to make that happen. The ICE contract, signed in 2012 and renewed in late 2017, allows the Kent County Jail to bill ICE for an agreed-upon price each day the jail holds a person with an immigration detainment request. In 2017, the Kent County Sheriff's Office kept 185 people jailed at the request of ICE, resulting in a revenue of $17,935, according to county spokesperson Lisa LaPlante. The jail's budget that year was $36 million. Without a contract, LaPlante said the county would continue to honor ICE detainment requests. The only difference is that the county could no longer hold detainees for up to 3 days. About 100 people intended to address the Kent County Board of Commissioners at their June 28th meeting, but it quickly fell into disarray when a protester interrupted a person giving public comment. Yeah. After the protester, Carla Barberi, refused to sit down, Board of Commissioners Chairman Jim Salfield called for deputies to remove her. She wasn't removed. A group of roughly 10 protesters then stormed the center of this commission floor with an anti-contract banner. As they did, Salfield suspended the meeting. He and most commissioners exited to the back. So it was a pretty exciting meeting. And let's not go too much into the particulars of the action itself, because I personally wasn't there. Although I will say one of the arrestees, friend of the show, we've interviewed her before, also running for office up there, Katie Steele Baroni. And hopefully I'm going to try to set up an interview with her sometime in the near future. But one of the things I found interesting, first off, is 93 days in jail, $500 fine. Let's compare and contrast that to the court case I actually had to deal with earlier this year. So, for some of you may know, last year, kind of late summer, Donald Trump was rescinding DACA. There was a huge demonstration and rally over at Bronson Park. We then marched over to the corner of Westnedge and West Michigan Avenue, and I and about seven others basically formed a human chain at the intersection and effectively blocked the street for about 45 minutes or so. We were arrested, and as the court trial weaved through, end of the day, we all had to commit to about 10 hours of community service. So we got off fairly light. And that was much kudos to our pro bono. That was an accidental genital joke, ladies and gentlemen. Was not planned. So, our pro bono attorney was actually able to whittle it down. The city itself actually wanted to come down a little bit harder on us. One could make some guesses as to why. There obviously a lot of the same protesters who were part of that Cosecha action have also been bugging Fred Upton pretty consistently for the past year or so. But all told, we ended up only getting about 10 hours of community service, and it all ended up being pretty straightforward. Now, in the actual text of the article, the actual charge is refusing order by police. Now, it'd be interesting to see how that actually played out on the ground. And again, I'll be trying to interview one of these arrestees. But I know when we were arrested, we basically, given the order to exit or get off the street by the officers. And they made that order about 3 different times. And after the third one, they started arresting us. And, basically just everybody was vocal with the idea. It's like, I will comply with this arrest, but I'm not going to move from the street. So, again, I'm not sure. Sorry. Ugh, my phone. Sorry, my phone went off in the middle of the radio show. So, again, though, I can't see. It's hard for me to imagine a circumstance where this harsh of a penalty is really necessary. $500, 90 days in jail, or 90 days in jail, I should say. It goes to show, we talked a lot about kind of what would happen committing civil disobedience here in Kalamazoo. It's something that, frankly, hasn't happened very often in the city's history. You'd have to go back a few years, really, to see that kind of thing happening in our kind of mid-sized hamlet of Kalamazoo. But a lot of it a lot of our planning had to do with just trying to figure out, well, how would the city actually respond to it? And, not to let, Kalamazoo Public Safety off the hook entirely. A large part of the reason that they were kind of so light-handed with us is because, the eyes of the public were just on them so much. And, we had a huge protest presence out there with Cosecha. There's several dozen people. It would have really put the city in a hard spot if they had attempted to be too draconian with their arrest. But as we see here in Grand Rapids, apparently they are not quite as fearful about that, which is really too bad. I will keep y'all updated on this situation as it develops. And honestly, I hope the city gets a little bit of pushback for laying down such a harsh judgment. It's civil disobedience is a protected part of our Constitution, protected free speech. Now, obviously, one understands part of civil disobedience is that one does disobey. So just by the very definition, you are going to be doing something where you fundamentally break the law. But it certainly does seem that the city went out of their way to throw down as harsh a judgment as possible. Now, by comparison, let's look at how some other major cities handle their protests. When I was at the DNC back in 2016 in Philadelphia, they were essentially giving people $100 tickets. They'd process everybody. It took about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then basically let them be on their merry way. Now, there was some other kind of baloney to go with that, as in trying to kind of artificially deflate arrest numbers. But again, that's the way the Philadelphia Police Department handles it. In Washington, D.C., they are very much used to political protests just about all the time. It's very similar. You spend a few hours being processed. You're more or less given a $100 ticket, and this is for the type of disobedience you might see where people will say sit on the Capitol steps or do a sit-in or something, basically being somewhere they are not supposed to be while taking part in a protest action. Of course, when these kind of tactics start coming into cities that don't typically see them, cities like Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo, you really don't know exactly how the city is going to come down and deal with it. So it's interesting to see it's kind of like this tale of two cities here, where this is how Kalamazoo dealt with it, this is how Grand Rapids dealt with it. And again, hopefully, once we get one of the actual locals down here, I'd really love to kind of go more into the weeds of it, talk about it in more detail. But again, solidarity with all our folks up in GR who are speaking truth to power, and power is not taking too kindly to it. So, I want to take a moment real quick and make a plug for something going on tonight while we're on the subject of Cosecha. So, Movimiento Cosecha Kalamazoo is actually going to be holding weekly rallies / vigils over at the Kalamazoo County Jail. And what they're going to be doing tonight, more or less, sorry, I got a little distracted there. So what they're going to be doing there tonight, the actual address is 1500 Lamont Avenue, and it's kind of in the same area as the Kalamazoo County Fairgrounds. But they're going to be they're going to be kicking off their weekly efforts tonight, and it's going to be at 8:30 p.m. until about 9:30 p.m. And I'll go ahead and just read the description from their page. Our government is tearing families apart, and we need non-cooperation with ICE policies in our community. This vigil will give space to those to support our community. Candles will be available, but please bring your own if you are able. Every Wednesday, vigils will be held at the same location until the resolution to stop ICE is introduced on August 7th, 2018. And there's going to be some speakers tonight. Nelly Fuentes, who is one of the main Movimiento Cosecha organizers, as is Eva Alvarez. And then Elvira Hernandez will also be speaking. And then our friend Ed Genesis. Most of those folks have actually been on the show at one point or another, but Ed Genesis, he was on our show a couple weeks ago talking about a young student who is being disproportionately punished by the Kalamazoo justice system. They're trying to basically give him some very disproportionate punishment for getting into an altercation with a teacher. He's going to be speaking about the intersectionality of mass incarceration in the school-to-prison pipeline. And then also speaking will be Samad Nadeem. And actually, I want to talk a little bit about Samad and his situation. For those of you who don't know, a few months ago on the show, we had Pastor Nathan on to talk about Sahida Nadeem. She is being kept up at the First United Church over there right in the heart of downtown. And she is somebody who has lived in the Kalamazoo community for decades, has raised a family here, used to work with mentally handicapped and disabled folks, basically working in a group home setting. So, by all counts, a very important and valuable member of our community. What happened to her, and, get into the specifics of it just a little bit. Her immigration attorney messed up and basically did her paperwork wrong. And since then, ICE has been seeking her for deportation. And it got to the point where she had to basically completely put her life on hold. She had to move out of her apartment. She had to quit her job and go seek sanctuary at the local church so that she wouldn't be abducted by ICE. And I want to kind of spin that with a little bit of good news. On Sunday night, we actually had a bit of a fundraiser over in the Vine neighborhood for Sahida and her cause. Ended up raising about $200, which is really grand. But I did want to remind everybody, too, if you want to help out with that effort, you can go to the church itself. They have yard signs and bumper stickers. You just want to support that way. You can also hit up Pastor Nathan or Pastor Sarah at the church if you want to get more heavily involved with the efforts around protecting Sahida Nadeem. But this rally that they're doing, and I want to speak a little bit more to this resolution that they reference in the event description here. Basically, what it is this. So, recently we've seen protests in the wake of the Trump administration's horrendous zero-tolerance policies. We've seen demonstrations in Battle Creek. We've seen demonstrations in Grand Rapids. There was a rally here in Kalamazoo. Although, frankly, I've got to wonder why you wouldn't just direct those people to go to an actual facility where ICE operates. But, I won't necessarily go into all the weeds with that one. But specific idea is that protesters are converging on these jails or these sites where local city, county governments are basically renting out room to ICE, or they have some sort of contract with ICE, like I mentioned in the last article, where there might even be like a financial benefit for the city to do this. In Kalamazoo, we don't have a actual ICE detention facility, but our local law enforcement does cooperate with ICE to the extent that they will hold prisoners for ICE here in our own community, here in our own jails. Now, our sheriff, Sheriff Fuller, he's gone on record before talking about He is against what ICE is doing right now. He does not believe that the immigrant community should be targeted to this extent. However, local law enforcement is still cooperating with immigration and customs enforcement to that extent. So this effort, these weekly vigils, which will be occurring tonight at 8:30, and then also July 18th, 15th, and August 1st, are all going to center around putting pressure on Sheriff Fuller and Kalamazoo law enforcement in general to no longer cooperate with ICE, to no longer hold prisoners for them in our local county jail. And I can't really recommend this kind of action enough. We've been talking on our show the last couple weeks. A lot of people even been talking to me in my own personal life about kind of a feeling of hopelessness. It's just things have gotten so bad, and there's this feeling like, what can you really do about it? What can you do about it in your own backyard to actually bring about change? And I'm telling you this, if you are mad about what the Trump administration is doing, or really, and let's be clear, we've talked about this on the show before, our transpartisan immigration policy that's really been in place over the last several decades, you could trace it to George W. Bush, to Bill Clinton, to George Jr. Obama, who again was called by immigration activists at the time the deporter-in-chief. ICE at the time had separating families in their own handbook as a method of deterrence. And yes, it feels it's difficult. It is a very difficult thing to deal with, watching all of this horrible injustice happening around us. Watch our country slip further and further towards overt fascism. But yes, there is something that you can do in your own backyard. We can make Kalamazoo a city that draws a line in the sand and says, no, we do not want to cooperate with ICE. We do not want you using our town, our facility, to engage in your arrests, to engage in your policies. And I want to give a quick rebuttal to some people who so abolish ICE has been gaining a lot of mainstream credibility as a policy plank, in large part thanks to, the horrible zero tolerance policy, and also some high-profile politicians who are starting to get behind it. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who the DSA member who won in that New York primary recently, has been very vocal about abolishing ICE. Now even some previous elected Democrats, such as Elizabeth Warren, such as Bernie Sanders, so on and so forth, have also become vocal about abolishing the organization and drastically rethinking our immigration policies overall. And, I really want to emphasize, this is the most effective thing that you can do just as an individual who lives in this town to really see that change happen at the national level. And honestly, it has to happen here locally. People in charge aren't going to change their ways. The people in charge, many of them are overtly white supremacists. They're not even hiding it. And, I'm not hyperbolizing it, by the way. There are many people in Trump's administration who make white supremacist hand signals in front of the camera and all these kind of wink and nudge references to white supremacist symbology. Trump himself, I think, is probably just straight up racist. I don't know if he's even quite intelligent enough to get invited to the kind of the Richard Spencer alt-right circles. But that's where it needs to start. And so often we will see, and this is going to be a bit of a criticism towards the rally we had in Kalamazoo here, we'll have like these big rallies, and people will come out, and it's more of a catharsis. It's like, I am so mad at everything going on in the world today, I'm just going to go out there with a sign, and then afterwards you take a nap, you have lunch, you post stuff about it on Facebook, but the buck ends up kind of stopping there. I'm telling you, the buck doesn't have to stop there, and in fact, this is work that should be done that is actually fundamentally far more important. This is a way to change ICE and the administration's policy in our own backyard that the administration does not control, that we control, that we can put pressure on our own local elected officials and see some actual change. And this does work. Local politics, it's not necessarily the same corrupt, locked in corporatocracy that we see up at the federal level. You can push these local politicians to change and to actually push their policy where it needs to go. So I'm telling you, I'm going to tell you this and reiterate, and I'm probably going to reiterate it again and again and again. 8:30 to 9:30 tonight, and for the next 3 weeks, go down to the county jail. Cosecha needs you. We can drive ICE out of our own backyards, and you know what? If enough towns say no, we are not letting ICE operate here, then you know what? Federal government doesn't want to abolish ICE? Well, we'll abolish ICE ourselves, and that's effectively how we can get it done. So, all right, with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a little bit of a musical break. When we get back, we're going to dig into some more stories here on the Hoodrat Strategist radio program. Again, your only source for political revolution. Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for political revolution. So, now we're back. I want to talk a little bit, let's expand the scope out, maybe talk a little bit more about national issues. Although this time, let's broaden it out to the Midwest in general. So there's been this talking point kicking around since the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it's been like this establishment talking point that's come out, basically saying that her victory only really worked because, you know, she was in a coastal area. She was in New York City. It's probably too far to the left to win in states like the Midwest. Now, you know, the quick take on that, and, you know, from Alexandria herself, is she listed a whole bunch of the states that Bernie Sanders won in the primary, such as Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, etc., that Hillary Clinton ended up losing in the general. And, you know, that's always been, you know, one of my big talking points. And if you actually look at a map of Michigan and where Hillary Clinton won, so it was still very close. But Bernie ended up pulling majorities geographically in most of the states, including right here in Kalamazoo. And Kalamazoo, Bernie Sanders actually won by a good, decent, like, I believe it's about a 15-point margin, maybe as high as 20. So, again, you know, right there, then and there, you can kind of debunk this idea that the Midwest doesn't like socialism. But I wanted to bring up this article that I found the other day. And it's called Democrats Ignore the Left at Their Peril. Midwesterners aren't scared of socialism. They're hungry for it. Now, here's the real amazing thing. This was published on July 9th. Now, where's this article from? Is it from Common Dreams? Is it from, Democracy Now? Is it from The Intercept? No, it's NBCnews.com. Let me repeat, NBCnews.com. This is the same network. MSNBC, but they're the same company, essentially. Same network that dearly departed journalist Ed Schultz, by the way, rest in peace, once said was completely in the tank for Hillary. Actually, one of the reasons he ended up leaving MSNBC, because he was a vocal supporter of Bernie Sanders, and he basically said the culture of the network was basically to make sure he wasn't covered as much as possible, not take his campaign seriously, and essentially push Hillary Clinton as much as possible. And what's amazing to see is just in recent weeks, we're really starting to see a paradigm shift in the way socialism and more or less the kind of progressive wave that Bernie Sanders helped facilitate, it's starting to be discussed in mainstream circles in a very different way. Another good example, people like Peter Dow, Joy Ann Reid, if you really follow kind of the pundits in mainstream media, these are the people who have been historically the most caustic and the most belittling towards democratic socialists and progressives and people who kind of came out of the Bernie movement. And their whole position is starting to really shift to the left. Perhaps you could say in a self-serving way, but it's interesting to see, like, these people generally do not have a mean thing to say about Alexandria. Now, granted, you will still have, like, these hardcore establishment loyalists. They're putting this crap out there about, like, oh, Alexandria wasn't working class. She grew up in a house. Or I've seen this stuff out there about how, again, like, we can't go too far to the left or even I have seen a few Russia-gatey things. Somebody thought it was some kind of Russian conspiracy because a Democratic Socialist is running unopposed against a really weak Republican. I bet Putin has something to do with it. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that neo-McCarthyism a little bit later on in the show. But again, it's pretty amazing to see this coming from a mainstream corporate network because let's keep in mind, and I'll talk a little bit about the history they describe in this article, but socialism, when you actually look at the history, is as American as apple pie. And, even right here in Michigan, we are the birthplace of, traditional radical union organizing, not the kind of establishment unions that, proliferate today. And even some of those radical unions that were birthed here in Michigan have since kind of ossified and gone more towards that sort of sellout position. We've also, we have a deep history, particularly the east side of the state, of radical organizing. It was here in Michigan that saw the birth of the White Panthers, which is basically a white affinity movement that was in line with the Black Panthers line of thinking. Black Panthers themselves had a very strong presence here in Michigan, in the Detroit area. And, we have a deep history of people like Eugene V. Debs, from, he certainly wasn't some liberal wank from the coasts. He was born in, Indiana. And let's talk a little bit about just, what this article has to say about socialism in the Midwest, because I think, again, it's very interesting, one, and it's also very informative, especially coming from NBC. So, from the worker struggles in the 19th and 20th centuries that won the 8-hour workday to the growth of a fighting labor movement to my own election as a millennial socialist city council member in Chicago, Midwesterners have consistently backed socialist movements and socialist candidates that reject the political status quo and fight for the working class values of solidarity and equality. Goes on to, I just talked about Eugene Debs, but he goes on to talk about sewer socialists govern Milwaukee and other areas of Wisconsin for decades, including Victor L. Berger, who in 1910 was elected to the House of Representatives. The same position Cortez is on the verge of winning this November. Midwestern cities and towns such as Dayton, Ohio, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Flint, Michigan all have proud socialist backgrounds. Appeal to Reason, the most widely read socialist publication in U.S. history, was published out on the plains of Girard, Kansas. Oklahoma was a national hotbed for Socialist Party organizing for much of the 20th century's first half. And I kind of wanted to expand on that a little bit, too. What's funny to me is this idea of socialism being tied in any way to kind of liberal elitism. It's always been tied to working class people, and frankly, it's mostly always sprung out of the Midwest and parts of the South. In the early part of the century, most socialist organizing didn't even take place in the cities. It happened in the Farm Belt, when a lot of people, a lot of farmers, sick and tired of being exploited by their corporations, forced their local governments to basically become more socialistic, more egalitarian in their policy, and enact punitive policies against corporations that would take advantage of the farmers and the peoples in those regions. It really is nothing new. And I wanted to say something that this article doesn't necessarily point out, but is very important to understand, is this idea that the Midwest, parts of the Midwest and the South are so inherently right-wing is actually a fairly new phenomenon. Again, this kind of working class solidarity was something that kept on through much of the 60s and 70s. Now, granted, there was always racism and there was always, class division along those lines, of course. This is America. But it wasn't until the 50s and 60s, when McCarthyism really took off, that we started to see this fracturing of socialism in the United States, and particularly in the Midwest. As the U.S. government and the propaganda tied with it, look up Operation Mockingbird when you get a chance, was able to paint socialism as friends of the communists, friends of the USSR, as somehow similarly in line with treason. They were able to purge socialists from places of influence, from their unions, for example. And they were able to basically weaken and fundamentally dismantle and destroy mass socialist organizing and mobilization in the Midwest. And this was done very deliberately. It didn't just die out because, these ideas weren't somehow popular. It was done through propaganda and basically brainwashing. That continues to this day. I mean, there is a reason Fox News targets particular areas of the United States and not, say, the liberal big cities. It's because it's very important to keep the people of the Midwest and people of the South with their eye always pointed at, the wrong target. To make sure that socialist organizing doesn't happen again. You could see it in the way that Fox News presents all of this. They talk about socialism as just this inherently evil thing. I mean, even throughout the Obama years, they would bop him over the head with that label without any real understanding or explanation of what socialism actually is or what it actually means. In fact, Mimi Solitsky was on Fox News very recently. He ran as the socialist candidate in the previous election, and all of the questions rotated around, well, what about Venezuela? What about Cuba? What about the USSR? And, to Mimi's credit, he tried to get in there, discuss actual American socialism. And of course, Fox News did their Fox News thing where they just constantly interrupt and cut you off before you get a chance to say anything of actual substance. But yeah, right-wing people are terrified of socialism taking hold in the Midwest because they know historically that's where it's really been strongest. That's where it could happen again. So they really want to, all of those super right-wing talking points and basic like Koch brothers brainwashing, that's the reason it focuses there geographically. They do not want that flower, that seed, to sprout there again because they know there's a lot of disaffected working class people in the Rust Belt. And if they emerged around a socialist working class consciousness, it would basically undo the last 40 years of Powell memo shenanigans that we've been seeing. And of course, we're already starting to see this happen. It's worth noting that they're giving this, firing off this talking point against Alexandria Cortez that she only won as a socialist because she's in like a metropolitan area. Well, what about Lee Carter, who was a Democratic socialist who won in West Virginia against an opponent who was the leading one of the leading Republicans in his state house? Hold on just a sec. I have a guest at the door. I'm going to go let them in. I will be right back. Dismantling that talking point about how socialism doesn't appeal to Midwesterners, but feel free to plug that in. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I'm back. Just letting in our first guest. They have a kind of flying solo today without a co-host, but you joined me at a pretty opportune time, actually. We were just discussing, you said you were listening a little bit on the way over, and I thought, you might have an interesting perspective on this as somebody who's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and was also running for the House of Representatives. But what have you found, this idea that socialism doesn't take root in the Midwest, even though historically that's always been the case?
Yeah, it's a lie perpetuated by the loudest of the media voices and the loudest of, quite frankly, the folks who are trying to involve us.
Actually, hold on just a sec. I think there's an issue with the microphone here. All right, can we hear you now?
Check.
Okay, yeah, there we go. Yeah. Sorry about that.
So, that's a lie, right? Like, the Midwest is the land of unions. It's the land of, if you need a cup of sugar, your neighbor will give it to you, no questions asked. We dig each other out of our driveways. We plow each other out in the winter. We are a socialist region of the United States. And to say anything otherwise, to say that we can't bring the Midwest into democratic socialism is just a lie formed by the people who are afraid of the people power that we have when we aggregate in large numbers like we historically have done, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think again, as we mentioned earlier, New Deal grandpa won a bunch of very key states like, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, and even a few states where it was very, very close, like Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. And I think Iowa is very interesting because, one of the main problems with his campaign was, it took a while for him to build momentum, being a nobody and unknown. And, how close Iowa came really shocked the political world at the time. I remember that. Nobody expected it to be that close. Actually, I think it ended up going down to a coin flip or some such thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and they have the interesting caucus there, too, so.
Oh, yeah. Yep, exactly. And, excuse me. And, let's not forget, too, this is not only recent history, that's not only early 20th century history, but also fairly recent history. The DSA has gotten basically over 44,000 members. They are more robust and have seen, because I think at this time, 2015, you could count their membership in 4 digits. So it's been a huge, incredible increase. The author of this article talks about his own chapter in Chicago, which he says now has over 1,500 members. And he said there's even chapters up here in Michigan, here in the Upper Peninsula. I know we've got one right here on the southwest side of the state, and there's a pretty big chapter out near Detroit and Ann Arbor. So, yeah, again.
We even recently, sorry to interrupt, but we even recently have been going around Southwest Michigan with our Southwest Michigan DSA chapter, door knocking to talk about socialist ideas and to try to get people on board for Medicare for All, since that's going to have to be a people-led movement, especially here in Michigan and other areas of the Midwest, where we don't have legislators championing the cause like we see on some of the coast. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And our numbers continue to grow every day. Even door knocking for my own previous campaign, I ran into several folks who left the Democratic Party. And I'm not talking about us young, millennial, progressive, Bernie bros, whatever you want to call us. I'm talking about people in their 70s, their 80s, former union leaders, people who became completely disenfranchised with the Democratic Party because of how far right we've shifted and how much we have lost a lot of our socialist roots. We've left them up hanging to dry.
That's right. It really shouldn't be surprising that, given the economic rightward shift of both political parties over the last several decades, it almost feels like we found this lost tome. It's been buried underneath in some sort of
capitalist dollars.
Capitalism. I was trying to think of like a good reference, like we're the Goonies and we found like the treasure chest or something. But yeah, it's very interesting to see like people are kind of reacquiring this knowledge, and even myself, and I think I'd say this for a lot of people my age, millennials. Before 2016. All I really knew about socialism was like, is that thing that happened in Russia? Like, I was radical, I had kind of like anarchist politics, but it feels like a real rediscovery of socialism amongst working class people. And I mean, again, NBC News article, it's very interesting that the mainstream establishment press is actually starting to acknowledge this. Mm-hmm. I invited Eponine on the show. We're going to be talking about a CD6 candidate who got caught up in some locker room talk. But before we shift to that topic, there was another important national issue that I really wanted to touch on before we get into that, and it is a bill, H.R. 6054, that was recently introduced. And I also want to bring this up because I know a lot of mainstream press isn't talking about this, and I know this would affect a lot of people in kind of the radical communities, activist communities.
This one's important.
Oh, yeah. It is called the Unmasking Antifa Act of 2018. It's introduced by Representative Donovan.
A coward.
Yeah. And it was referred to the Committee of the Judiciary. And let me just read just a couple excerpts from this. Here's the actual language of the bill. Whoever, whether or not acting under color of law while in disguise, including while wearing a mask, injures, oppresses, threatens, or intimidates any person in any state, territory, commonwealth, possession, or district in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution or laws of the United States, or because of his having so exercised the same, shall be fined under this title, imprisoned not more than 15 years, or both. So, just reading that by itself is like, oh man, I'm glad somebody's finally doing something about the Klan. No.
Oh, I wonder if it'll be a two-way street.
So something tells me not so much. As the song says, some of those that burn crosses are the same that hold office. Mm-hmm. But, let me get your reaction, because I've definitely got a few things to say about this. But, I know you heard about this story, but what's just your take as an activist and somebody who has run for office before?
Yeah, so as soon as I saw murmurings on the internet about this bill, I immediately went and read the full text to see could this be real? A bill against anti-fascists in the United States of America in 2018? Although, can we really be surprised by anything anymore? The whole bill is a pile of garbage, but the thing that stuck out to me the most as the most frightening aspect of the bill, that it's even in there, is the fact that they consider intimidation a punishable offense of up to 15 years. So if I'm wearing a bandana and I say boo to an ICE officer, he can pretend that I was so intimidating in my disguise that I should be imprisoned for 15 years. That is fascism at its finest, folks.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because that's like the language in this bill is so vague that somebody being arrested for this you could construe this just about any way you'd like. If you injure, oppress, or threaten or intimidate, it's like anybody could really make that kind of claim. It needs, it doesn't even specify because even I would be like, okay, if they're talking about committing violent harm behind another person, I would probably still rebuke with anti-fascists do not harm innocent people. They specifically are self-defense against white supremacists and Nazis and stuff. But this it's so broad. The idea would be if you're an anti-fascist and you are wearing a mask and you maybe try to defend some people from, say, some Proud Boys, you could legally, under this law, you could be arrested for basically exercising your right to protect other people from white supremacists.
Now, my hope is that this potential law, this bill, is so far-fetched. I don't think it will ever gain the support needed in the House to pass it. Hopefully. This has been a whirlwind of surprises in this administration and this Congress. But we'll see. Another thing that they had in there that was so vague was they just say a disguise. They then go on to elaborate that as a mask. At what point does it stop? A bandana? Some face paint? They do not... It's, as you said, they leave it completely open to interpretation. And with laws like that, we know that they always side with the interpretation of the quote-unquote law, as legal as that may or may not be.
Yeah, and a very interesting point that was brought up to me. I was discussing this with a friend. Is we mentioned a little bit about just like kind of McCarthyism and whatnot. You remember, like, back in the day, anybody who was a socialist, a communist in this country was, like, purged and targeted and arrested. There was never any equivalent targeting of people who were Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. Not even during World War II. Their free speech rights were actually more well protected than people on the left.
There's a reason many of the Nazi soldiers over in Germany fled to the United States once World War II was done. There's a reason they came here.
Yeah, exactly. We'll keep an eye on that bill. And, it's really part of a disturbing trend where, we've seen other kinds of legislation like this where, the idea of making it legal to hit protesters with your car. And, most states that have brought that forward, it ends up dying rightfully. Although I think it actually did pass in North Dakota. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, it's part of a disturbing trend where we're seeing this reaction from the state targeting dissent and basically getting enough support from. Because you got to remember, like, the propaganda that's spun out to people who support this kind of policy, like Antifa are violent, and they're just going after Republicans and Trump supporters, and they're just going around causing chaos and beating people up. And to be honest, there is a little bit of chaos and beating people up in there, but it is towards people who, again, are standing there saying, like, certain people don't have a right to exist and we should live in a white ethno-state. So.
Right. It's the same people who are celebrating our troops, including those who went over to fight in World War II, celebrating them for fighting these fascists, and then turning around and saying, well, you can't protest at home. That's not right.
Yeah, and let's remember, too, like, the first meeting of quote-unquote Antifa, anti-fascist action was about 80 years ago in Germany before World War II. Antifa has a deep and rich history. I'd actually recommend anybody wants to learn more about it, check out Mark Bray's book, The Anti-Fascist Handbook. He really delves into the history of anti-fascist organizing and tactics. And yeah, it's anti-fascism is as old as fascism. And much like socialism, it is about as American as apple pie.
That's right.
All right, I think with that, let's go ahead and take a little break. Y'all are listening to the Hoodrat Strategist radio program only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for political revolution.
WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for radio evolution.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. So, as I said, we are joined by Eponine Garrod. She is a local activist and former candidate for right here in Congressional District 6. Also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And I invited you on because we've got a story. I just found out, we just all found out about it a couple days ago. Although I got to say, this makes me regret, I'm supposed to be like the studious one who does all like the background research. And I forgot that George Franklin wrote a book and I forgot to read it. And if I had, probably would have found out about this a lot sooner. But what this story is about, George Franklin was engaged in a bit of locker room talk in his book Cereal Wars, which was published in 2014. And before we get into the thick of it, let me actually read directly from the book. And again, this is George Franklin, congressional candidate for here in the 6th District. And these are his words directly, verbatim, from the book. And he's talking about, the book is all about like his time as a lobbyist for Kellogg's, hence the term Cereal Wars, and talks a lot about like the interactions he'd have on Capitol Hill and whatnot. Here's something he mentions about a particular interaction. Most tasks were mundane, but parts of the job were a lot of fun, especially when a visit to the office of Charlie Wilson from Texas was required. Texas Charlie, who had become famous in the movie Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks, ran a front office that looked like a hookers convention. This was a welcome duty since the front office looked like a parody of a whorehouse. There were girls with big hair, big boobs, and short skirts. A testament to this is a famous quote from Wilson who said, "You can teach them to type, but you can't teach them to grow tits." Okay. And this last line really seals the deal because this last line here is really damning. This one I'm about to read, because you would think after that maybe there'd be some reflection. I believe one of his supporters even said like, "Oh, we was trying to explain just how things were back then and how it was problematic." So how does he explain how problematic this is? Well, he finishes off by saying, "Ahem. Charlie Wilson was one of the great characters ever to work on the Hill, and a visit from his office was cherished by every intern."
Yay.
Oh, wow. You know what? I mean, I'll just let you lead off. Like, so, Eponine, I know you were pretty furious when you found out about this as somebody who was running against him just a few weeks ago. And I just, I'll just ask, what is your reaction to this?
Well, to start, I wasn't too surprised. Much like you, I hadn't delved into the book before, but that was kind of an active choice in that I didn't want him to profit off of me reading it by purchasing it. He's a corporate lobbyist. He doesn't need a single cent of mine. So when this quote started circulating, I started digging into the book and checking for more, because that's the thing with somebody who is sexist or who is in the business of making sexist remarks, is it's not just one time, it's repetitive. There's a cycle. So that quote that we have here was on page 10, so you didn't have to get very far into the book. And then if you keep going, there's also in page 23 a little bit more, not quite as damning perhaps as that one, but he describes one of his friends, Gary Frink. I'll just read it for you. He says, "Gary Frink is an unforgettable man, jazz drummer, lawyer, and K Street restaurant aficionado. He worked out of a spacious rented home on the part of the Massachusetts Avenue known as Embassy Row," blah, blah, blah. Continue paragraph about Mr. Frink. Right before that, he describes a female colleague, and this is the description she gets. Further rounding out the new public affairs function would be Peggy Wollerman, a striking blonde with a degree in nutrition from Ohio State University.
Oh, that's it? Or is it?
It talks a little bit more about what her job is, but...
Yeah. I'm kind of disappointed. I wanted to know a little bit more about the other guy's appearance. Like, did he have deep, sultry eyes? Or no?
I don't even know what color his hair was.
Yeah. But, all kidding aside, that is telling, though. It's this idea, and again, this is 2014. by the way. This was
Correct.
not very long ago.
4 years ago, as a grown adult, because as you mentioned, several of his supporters have tried to defend the passage by saying, oh, well, I talked to him and he would never talk like this anymore. He assured me he was just in his 20s. Or how dare you take that out of context? There is no context. That is the whole story. And I did take photos of the pages and post them online as well so folks could see for themselves. I understand wanting to be suspicious of fragmented quotes and what you hear online. That is critical in this day and age, so I get it. But that is the context, and it's posted there. As well, as Andy mentioned, he published this book 4 years ago. He made no changes to that story. However old he was when he wrote it, that's still the way he remembered it. He still fetishized those women from that office who I'm sure, based on that quote from the guy he was working with, were hypersexualized. They were more than likely sexually harassed. If you have a boss who's going to say that he can't teach you to grow tits, and he still thinks of them that way. And if he wants to tell me that he's repented, boy, he should have come out with that 4 years ago when he wrote the book.
Yeah, like, why wasn't that in the book? You know, it's like, you know, you could say, like, well, this was before the Me Too movement. Feminism has been going on for a while.
About as long as women have existed.
Yeah, and not even that, but it's like common kind of manners and politeness. Like, yeah, I don't think you'd even really need to be like an outspoken feminism to realize how inappropriate that is. Like, at least you should.
That's exactly right. And I've even had one of his supporters came on to describe herself as a proud feminist, because originally we had a lot of male supporters coming out to defend his actions, and that just was a very poor idea on behalf of their campaign. Yeah. That backfired pretty quickly. So I've seen, even just today, an influx in his female supporters coming out. And one person even said that his book has been picked up for a miniseries in large part due to the comic relief, I assume. Sexism isn't funny.
Wait,
women's bodies aren't jokes.
Was that a defense? Like,
that was supposed to be a defense.
I don't care if it ends up on Netflix. We're talking about a guy who could be our next congressperson.
You know, we've had comedians in the Senate before who thought that women's bodies were a joke, and look how that turned out.
Yeah, frankly, like, from what it says in this book, just like describing women that way, I mean, I don't know if you could say it was worse than Al Franken, but like, usually somebody who would speak in that manner, probably there's some sort of, you know, actionable behavior behind it. But let's not get into
we don't want to accuse him of anything that we don't know about, but what we do know is what's in the book, and that in and of itself is more than enough to seal the deal for me. And
then you brought up the discussion. I did want to kind of talk about that a little bit. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening, it's the Pro-Kazoo community discussion. It's like an open discussion board that Pro-Kazoo hosts, and you can find it on Facebook. You know, some of the other things I saw that I really wanted to point out is problematic. So again, you know, you mentioned, like, you know, taking out of context, and then a lot of people, you know, a defense that started coming up was, well, the original poster, the person who originally shared this, is part of, is it that they're a volunteer or that they are a staffer for Matt Longjohn?
I believe she's a staffer.
Okay.
I'm not even 100% sure because we've known each other since high school, so it's not like we're just suddenly friends on Facebook. We were in marching band, so was her sister. Like, we go back a ways.
And, sorry. I was just getting contacted by our next guest. And one of the things that fundamentally bothered me about that, and you had other people stepping in, even one of the Pro-Kazoo moderators stepping in to, well, a source is important. And, you know, a source is important, but to using
I had posted the source.
Yeah, exactly.
It was the book.
yeah. The source was the book. Exactly. You know, if this had come from, like, you know, some recording somebody had done of him or something, you know, it might have a different connotation, but no, this was literally in his own words. But they try to change the conversation to be like, well, we shouldn't see this as valid because whoever posted had some sort of intent that was tied into like either somebody else's campaign and like I said on the thread, truth is truth. And this is a tactic. You don't just see this with George Franklin in this situation. This gets used so often by people who run these kind of establishment-style campaigns where when they are backed into a corner, they will obfuscate, they will blame. I think probably the best example of this, 2016, when all the WikiLeaks dropped, they shifted the entire conversation to not talk about the actual contents of them, but talk about the motivations of the people who posted it, or how it would play out strategically in an election. But the problem is, it doesn't change the fact that George Franklin wrote this. George Franklin wrote this and put it in his book.
Yep, that was a conscious decision made by him at a time when he would have described Fred Upton as one of his close friends.
And he did say that too. Again, like, this isn't the first time we've seen this weird kind of obfuscation from George in his campaign. He's talked about how like he's standing up against Fred Upton, but he, that post you shared, he's had a very close relationship with him for years,
both personally and financially.
Mm-hmm. And I've got to let my next guest in just a sec. So I will be right back.
And we'll
Oh, okay. Actually, Andrew's going to help us out in a minute.
Thanks, Andrew.
Let her in. Sorry. Okay. So, again, we talked about George on the show before, and we've even asked him point blank about the fact that he's donated thousands of dollars to Fred Upton and many other Republicans. And, his main defense of that is that, it was part of his job as a lobbyist. Again, like, this isn't the first time we've seen these kind of obfuscations from his campaign. I wanted to talk a little bit about, how you see this in the greater texture of George Franklin as a candidate, and the fact that he's got this problematic donation history, and now this kind of overt sexism that we're seeing from his book.
Mm-hmm. Well, to round it out, to me, George Franklin, all of his behaviors align perfectly with what you'd expect out of any older, particularly older white men who have been playing the political game and been part of the system for so long. And I think that this is a great transition into it's not just how he is as a candidate, it's not just what's in his book, it's the choices that he personally makes outside of throwing money at organizations to claim charitable work. So I think this probably would be a great transition into some breaking news, I guess, that we have. Mm-hmm. Something that has not been publicly released about George that we're here to distribute with you today. And this has all been fact-checked. It's been verified. There's public records, which I'll post later today. But George Franklin has been committing tax fraud from 2010 to 2016. Yeah. So so a little bit of background first. A property owner can only claim a principal residence exemption in Michigan on primary residence. However, George also owns a condo with his wife in Atlanta, and he's been receiving a homestead tax exemption since 2007. He's also received a primary residence exemption on a condo he owned in Kalamazoo from at least as far back as 2006, from where the public records I could see went, until 2016. So he was illegally receiving tax breaks from 2010 to 2016 by declaring two separate homes to be his primary residence. Now, for a lot of people, you could say, well, maybe they didn't know, maybe that was a mistake. But come on, this guy was a corporate lobbyist for the bulk of his adult life.
Yeah.
There's no way he didn't know the laws and know that he was getting away with that.
It's literally his job to kind of know, the nuts and bolts of all of these things.
So we are supposed to believe that he, running as a Democrat for our district, would vote for our favor to take away tax breaks from the elite, from the rich, when he himself has profited off of it for at least 6 years that I can find in the public records. That, combined with all of this other information that we've been finding, his donations to Upton, to John Prost, to Chanya Schuetmaker, to PACs that donated primarily to Republicans all the way back into the 90s, describing Upton as a close personal friend, these things do not go together to equate to a person who I can put trust into to represent me, to represent this district, and to represent the values that I care about, both within the Democratic Party and within the Socialist Party. It doesn't add up.
So, here's a question. So he has a lot of endorsements from mainstream Democratic officials, Jennifer Granholm, Dan Kildee, a couple of the other House reps from the east side of the state. Some unions from here in the 6th District have endorsed him. Have you heard any response yet to these recent revelations? And if not, I mean, what do you think these individuals should do about, like, the fact that they've endorsed George when, one, you've got this overtly, like, kind of locker room talk as quote that's come out, and two, like, as you literally just talked about, he's actually got caught up doing something illegal. That's tax fraud, right?
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, like you mentioned, he does have a lot of endorsements from some big names. Even today, I know a lot of his supporters have been posting all over my page that he was endorsed by the Progressive Women's Alliance of West Michigan, which I'd be very interested to see how that goes now that all this news is breaking. So one of the things that's interesting to note, George has a very robust donation history in the political field. He's donated to both sides of the aisle, using his money as a well-to-do man to push agendas that he personally wants to see. Sometimes they're agendas that benefit lots of people, but he's still willingly been part of the system that is so debilitating to so many. Perhaps it's just merely a coincidence that so many of these folks who have endorsed him have also received donations from him, including the Women's Alliance that endorsed him today. They received $500 from him sometime within the last couple years. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that these people are only endorsing him because of that money, but I'm also saying we have a pretty corrupt system in which money can have you turn a blind eye to some things. So I wonder if perhaps they're giving him these endorsements because they've had a relationship in the past which has been strictly financial for the most part, or business related at least, and they're not doing their research because they don't want to see what's behind door number 3, so to say.
And, I'd like to comment, too, after we had George come on our show and, we interviewed all of the 6th District congressional candidates. And one of my main talking points about George since then is like, okay, strip away all the scandals. His platform is, it's just nothing but platitudes and fluff. I haven't seen him talk about actual plans, actual legislative ideas. Even on his own website, he talks a little bit about some of his past accomplishments, but there's nothing concrete on there at all. And even, Rich Eichholz, who's probably to the, he's more of a centrist than everyone else running, he has concrete ideas and plans. He's more of a moderate, and like everybody else running had very solid ideas, concrete policy platform ideas. George came on our show, and me and my co-hosts had to actually educate him on some very basic electoral reforms that everybody else on the show knew right away what we were talking about. So it just keeps begging the question, you have this guy who some people are saying might end up being the candidate because, you see his ads all over TV. He's got money.
He's got money.
But, he seems to be just have a deep deficit of actual reformist ideas. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about how that connects, you think, to the fact that he is part of this older network. And he reminds me of the type of campaign a Democrat might run in like the 90s, you know?
Yeah.
That disconnect between how everybody else running at least kind of maybe even tries to lie about the fact they're a reformer, and that from George, you don't see any of that at all.
Yep. He's running his campaign like it's a popularity contest, and if he drops the name of the other popular kids, that'll make him popular too. One of the best examples of that, I mean, you talked about how he really doesn't have any kind of platitudes when it comes to his policies or ideas. Many times in forums, we would be asked a question about education, and he would always answer with, well, first, I would fire Betsy DeVos. And everybody claps for that because everybody hates Betsy DeVos. She's Michigan's succubus. And Congress can't fire Betsy DeVos. You cannot march into Congress and fire Betsy DeVos. So it is just fluff. It is all fluff and no actual content. And so when you actually dig through this pile of endorsements from people who have hardly ever, if at all, set foot in this district, when you dig through all the talk about Pop-Tarts and yeah.
Just side note, this is, do you mind if I tell this story real quick?
Please do. It's just another example.
We were at a congressional forum, you know, all of the candidates were there, and it was very quick popcorn style, like each candidate got 10 minutes, so everybody else was focusing on like hard policy questions from the audience and stuff. George spent about 5 to 6 minutes of his time playing a trivia game about Kellogg's and Pop-Tarts and
trying to buy someone's support with a t-shirt.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A free t-shirt to whoever can answer these trivia questions about Pop-Tarts. Because the guy, you know, what he's doing is working for some folks. So he's very intelligent in that regard, in that he does know how to play the system. He was a corporate lobbyist for, I think, around 30 years for Kellogg, and he will talk Kellogg up and down, highlighting the Kellogg Community Foundation, and leave out, you know, the marketing of pure sugar to children, et cetera, et cetera. He talks about lobbying like he's having a love affair with it. He is infatuated with capitalism and with lobbying. So he was very good at what he did. And that's exactly the approach that he's taking now. He is using our district like a corporation and trying to lobby for himself to get into Congress. And it doesn't stand a ground with anyone who actually is willing to push beyond and ask the hard questions or even the mild questions. And so I think that is what is going to make or break his campaign. He could slide by on his money, but the only way he does that is if we, the people who can see through the lies, see through the screen, and see that he has no substance, work hard to spread that information. Because none of the other candidates are self-made. I don't know how much money he has, but enough that he is pretty much destroying everybody in the fundraising. Unless we unite people and people power to spread the message about him, he has a good chance, unfortunately.
Yeah, like I said, I see his ads just about every morning at work, and you know, I did want to, like, side note, so we actually do have some colleagues who have endorsed him, and I think it is worth noting that, you know, when I talk about George Franklin, I'm not saying like he's just like this super villain. Apparently he's definitely sexist though, but
right.
He has done some good work for you know, people in the community.
Well,
like,
he's given money to people who are doing good work.
Yes, and so, like, I guess I should say that, like, he supported organizations in the community. So, for example, some of our colleagues, like I know Gwendolyn Hooker and Shannon Sykes have talked about endorsing him based on like his investment in the North Side. So I wonder, like, I brought this point up the other day, and I was wondering if maybe, you know, you could address it too as somebody who just ran for office. You know, is like supporting an organization that does work in the community, should that be seen as a credential as a legislator? You know, my main argument is like, good, let him do the work, but I don't think he's qualified for Congress.
Right. Yeah. If he wants to continue funneling money into good organizations, that's wonderful. That's great. We need more people like him with the money to be able to do that. But it's also a bit of an illusion, and it's an illusion that Fred Upton does as well, to draw yet another parallel. Fred Upton continuously votes 100% on the Republican Party line, but he personally gives money to CHIP. He gives money to charitable organizations.
He stood by immigrants in our community who are being threat of deportation. So.
Yeah, so if I have $10,000 and I throw $1,000 towards a really great cause, and then I throw, $3,000, $4,000 towards a legislator who's going to vote to continue to undermine and systemically oppress the people that I just threw $1,000 to, I'm still no good. I'm still no good.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Epi, for coming on to the show and talking about that.
It's always a pleasure.
I didn't know she was going to be coming in with the tax stuff, so we'll try to get the show uploaded later and spread the word. That's some pretty serious stuff.
I'll post links on my personal page as well. I mean, it's all public record. It's all documented. This is not just false allegations. I take that incredibly seriously. This is just what happens when you try to run somebody who's been part of the political underbelly for so long and try to put them as a front runner in a progressive area.
Yeah. All right. We're going to take a quick little break. Next up, we've got a guest on the show to talk about some transphobia here in the community. Y'all are listening to the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo, your only source for political revolution. Let's go to a quick musical break. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. This is the Hoodrat Strategist radio program, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. So we are joined today by Miranda Lee. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yep. And we're going to be discussing kind of an incident that happened to you down at Chow House. Yes?
Right.
So I'll let you kind of describe what happened, then we'll go a little bit deeper into it and kind of what that means here in Kalamazoo. So,
okay, sure.
So you work down at Chow House, and you had an interaction with a customer. I guess we'll put it that way.
Well, so like the word incident sounds so ominous, right? Like this incident, but you'll kind of see where I'm going with that. So yeah, it was like this past weekend, and I guess there's this group. A local, faith-based organization or whatever. A family came in, sat at the table, and I went out to be a server for them or whatever, get drinks. Took their drink order or whatever. Went back, and I was making their drinks and whatnot. So then I'm approached by the mom of the group. She sort of said, well, we're leaving. This place isn't really a good fit for us. I was like, okay, I innocently enough, thinking like maybe it's German food, these sorts of things. Not everybody knows the cuisine very well. They had kids, could be anything. So they left. I wished them a nice day, and I go back to like reset their table or whatever. And here's this sort of like a religious pamphlet, placed on the table, subtly or not so subtly, And this is the challenge really with transphobia. And, there's really two kinds. Let's say there's the blatant, I hate you because you're trans. Then there's these sort of mystic moments, I'll call them, where you're left kind of in this gray space to pick up the pieces. What does that interaction mean? Was that really, transphobia? Is it me? Is it them? And it's a really awkward space, and it's really hard for people to grasp onto that, right? So even after the incident, I spent a lot of time in my own head trying to figure out what really happened. But I think that based on the way that like the father of the group, or I guess that was who he was, the sort of the person that was leading the family, was sort of taken aback when I approached the table, and you get those kind of odd looks and these sorts of things, so I mean, I'm optimistic enough to think that maybe it isn't, but sort of a realist to know, that this sort of stuff does happen quite often. And Chow House, we're not really shy about our connection to the LGBT community. We have visibly trans people there. We have signs in the door that say we're an LGBT-owned, QIAA plus owned organization, and we don't ever hide that. We are who we are, but we also believe in, we accept people for who they are unless they're mistreating someone. So that's how I approach every interaction. I don't try to prejudge in these sorts of things. But then I was talking to some friends afterwards, and they said, well, this organization tends to have a very sort of right-leaning ideology. They're very much like an evangelical organization. So that kind of, you start putting two and two together, and that's sort of what other conclusion can you kind of come to? Well, there's a lot of conclusions people could come to, but from the perspective of someone in the community, and I can't speak for every trans person or every person in the LGBTQIA plus family or whatever, but there's been typically so much trauma that's happening, you kind of have to, that's where your head has to go as sort of a means of survival. And so that was sort of where that interaction left, is in this kind of weird space that I'm sure for these people that were in the restaurant, it was a 5-minute thing. We're all left sort of wondering, well, was that, what happened? And, that's the burden of that.
And, what was really interesting to me about this story, and I think like more stories like it really need to be talked about. It's like often you really only hear about this sort of stuff publicly when it's that kind of, like I said, that aggressive kind of style of discrimination, or kind of a recent local example. There was a guy who was posting a bunch of like kind of Nazi white supremacist stuff on his Facebook page, and then he essentially got his he owned a beer brewery and got shut down basically. But there are other more subtle, forms of it that are also kind of toxic and insidious, and so that this couple or this family, that is kind of left you this note, and the whole subtext of it is we don't approve of the way you're doing things, and almost like we would like to. Is it kind of like an invitation to convert you, or just the idea that being in the presence of somebody who's part of the LGBTQA community was somehow so disturbing for them that they had to leave? And I was just curious, like, one, is this an kind of interaction that you had to deal with a lot at Chow House, or even just in the broader Kalamazoo community?
So here's the fun part, right? It's I grew up down south, and there's so much more of what you call the aggressive sort of phobias or isms. And what I've noticed here is, people can very much be polite to you, and you don't ever know. And then they leave, they never come back, they eat their dinner because they're hungry or whatever, which is fine, but you don't ever know, like, where their head is at. And so the likelihood is that there's a lot more of these incidences that happen that you would never even really pick up on, right? And honestly, I mean, I have my own life to live. I can't spend my entirety of my existence questioning every moment. But that is what makes this sort of interaction so insidious. You can't quite put your finger on it, and honestly, if I was interacting with somebody that said, oh, you bleep, 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 blah, 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 okay, that would hurt for a little bit, or maybe not at all, and it would roll off, right? Like, that's just some hater, blah, blah, blah. But it's these sort of like, is that really what it is that forms like this constant, like, imagine if you had a broken radio that was playing music, but that buzz constantly that just annoys the daylights out of you, makes it so hard to just enjoy the radio. And that's what a lot of this, that's the majority of what I've experienced personally. And I can't speak for every member of the trans community. There have been people that I know that have experienced horrible incidences, and I'm just fortunate that I haven't drawn that lot. And we have to be very careful about that. But, it is so much harder on a day-to-day basis to even do little things when you constantly have to second guess, and I think that's where people don't really grasp on. It's easy to say, oh yeah, we need to stop violence, but microaggressions and these sorts of things are much harder for people to understand and cope with and deal with on an activist basis, or on a sort of an allyship basis, or those sorts of things, right? And the other crazy odd place I go in my head, and forgive the use of the word crazy, it's sort of ableist, but it's the famous argument, well, am I just being intolerant? And you have to go down those roads. I think as a moral, or a person that's interested in having some sort of morality, is it's very easy to react, but then you constantly kind of have to check your own self, and am I just overthinking? So I don't know. I think that forms this huge burden that a lot of people have to deal with. Not just trans people or LGBTQIA+, not folks in the family, so to speak, but anybody that lives in sort of an identity-based space. Those issues have to be present, right? Like, my husband was saying, the hard part is, well, you could argue not all Christian folk are like that, but there's enough, and it's random enough, that then you have to say, well, which one is it? Is today the day that I'm going to get the person that woke up with a complex and has decided today's the day they're going to solve some problem with violence? Or, is that person the good Christian? Is that person the bad Christian? How is this interaction going to go out? And so I think that's the biggest, impact. But again, it's hard to say every incident that happens. We've been pretty fortunate, I think, partly because we're so vocal about who we are, people sort of naturally kind of filter themselves out, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if you have somebody that's incredibly transphobic, they wouldn't necessarily come in as soon as they see me. And that has happened a couple of times where somebody's come in the door, they've seen me, they've walked away. We used to have a smaller shop on Burdick Street over by the State Theater. I was outside handing out menus. And I had gone back in to get menus, and this guy had come, and he was standing outside smoking a cigarette, and he was looking in the window. So I went out to hand him a menu, and he took a step away from me. And so I took a step towards him because I thought maybe he was smoking, and maybe he didn't want this. Okay, maybe he didn't want the smoke going in my face. So I took a step towards him, and this person was terrified, and they took more steps back, and they started kind of running down the street, and so. But those have been thankfully very few and far between, for us. And hopefully that continues. I don't know. So hopefully that answered kind of your question. It was the long answer to a short question.
Oh, no. I'm glad. I think we need to kind of really go in depth and have bigger discussions about that. Because, I think there's... Because there's this whole... You brought up the idea of tolerance. And that's something that I was thinking about a lot with this issue. And particularly, you have people like this... The people from this church, this evangelical church, who, it's probably in their wheelhouse of thought that, it's wrong to be gay or it's wrong to be trans. However, it's interesting to me. It's like this interaction happened right across the street from the first congressional UCC. And I know that's a church that is very welcoming and accepting of people in the LGBTQA community. So there is a model for that. There is a model for faith-based organizations in the city that don't take that kind of stance necessarily. And, kind of from where you're at, there's been... in the last few years in greater, American culture, kind of a greater awareness has been raised about, trans people, and there's more visibility now. How has that been like navigating for you? Not only thinking about kind of how the culture has shifted in the last few years, but also that sort of, kind of backlash to it.
So it's interesting. Part of, I think, the byproduct addresses that issue of the whole tolerance thing, in that that's really like a form of gaslighting, right? So you have somebody that's, like myself, that grew up literally terrified of being who I was, right? And at the hands of various faiths or social institutions, it's sort of suffered discrimination and these sorts of things. And then to come out and say, well, listen, this has to stop. And you say, well, you're just being intolerant, right? Of course, that's like, that's gaslighting in its definition. And there is no form of intolerance to say, like, the transphobia needs to stop, right? So you get into this as the visibility increases, we're like navigating these issues. But the weirdest part about it, and I again, I don't speak for everybody, but I think that what you have are groups that hear the buzzwords that we're using, and they don't have an innate understanding of what they mean, because like we have to live them, and then they'll hear them and they think they're using them appropriately, and they're not, and it just comes out as more abuse or more victimization, right? And that's the almost in some ways like the worst part of it is when people think, oh, well, this isn't me being abusive, this is me just trying to apply the same standards, or this is me using the same language you are, but they're not, and so that's a byproduct of the visibility, is when groups that aren't LGBTQIA plus, I'll say family, non-family sort of groups, they don't have that same innate understanding of the culture and of the language, and then when they try to apply it to their own arguments, it just comes out as a weapon, or it's weaponized, and I think that that's been a hard issue for other family members, quote unquote, to deal with, to say, well, I don't know how to defend against that when that starts coming, because I don't have a response. And then I immediately start going back in my own head about being a victim of that gaslighting, so then it really kind of destroys any chance I have of kind of getting an equal footing. There's a perception of visibility, but I think it's the kind of visibility in the sense of, people seeing things that they don't want to see. They know it's there, but they keep it on the edge of their consciousness. And it's still not like we're visible in a way that we're visible members of society as being productive human beings, right? That have goals, and we're seen as the movie stars that are on the screen, or we're seen as token representations in the media or certain polarizing figures, but we're not seen as just integral parts of the community. But again, the downside of the visibility too is the more visible you are, the more likely you could be to be a target, right? Mm-hmm. Because, and I was speaking to a friend of mine today who comes from a country where LGBT or family members aren't visible. They're not. Or they're not as, and it really is that sort of like, you don't exist, and they said, if you were to be visible, you would be targeted, and so it's the upside and the downside of visibility. But the upside too is we are gaining some ground. 10 years ago, would I have ever felt like I could live in the community out? No, I wouldn't have. And as a matter of fact, I didn't, So again, it's a complicated answer, because what the community sees, and this maybe speaks to visibility too, what the community sees is they see the point words or the power words like out or out of the closet or, these sorts of things, but they don't see the complex psychology that is behind that process, so... and that's just like it. There's no solid answer for that, and that answer is different for everybody as well.
And something that I was thinking about on the walk here. I think a lot of people listening to this, and I mentioned this kind of at the beginning of our discussion, might see this. It's like, well, it's like, you weren't yelled at, you weren't assaulted. It is still a form of gaslighting, and it's still a form of like marginalization. But something that really made me think about it is like, it's really important to understand how attitudes towards trans folks and people in the LGBT community overall, they can have really disastrous effects that aren't related to just specifically like these very violent incidents. I know a few weeks ago on the show, we were discussing a man on death row who essentially he was sentenced to death, and part of the conversation of the jury was the idea that they thought about giving him life in prison, but because he was gay, and the jurors literally came to this conclusion, they thought, well, we were going to give him life in prison, but we thought as a gay man he would enjoy it too much. The idea that, you're going to have a lot of gay sex in prison or something. So the idea is that like these people probably wouldn't say, oh, we hate homosexuals, but this kind of institutionalized discrimination makes them draw conclusions that, yeah, they dehumanize them or come to these very erroneous and really oppressive conclusions.
And it is, again, I liken it to when I was young, I would walk across my yard and I stepped on an ant pile and I got bitten by ants. Well, all I could focus on was, ow, the ants are biting me, but I'm not focusing on the fact that I just destroyed their entire environment, right? And I think that's sort of the analogy is, from the outsider's view, it's like, well, I'm just going about my day, but they don't see the impact that, I as an ant have when they step on my house. My world gets destroyed. But here's the when you were talking about that, it really crystallized in my mind about this argument. Well, they weren't yelled at, or they weren't the victims of these sort of, again, aggressive or blatant. But then my question to those people is, how much abuse should we suffer before it's considered legitimate? How much, and not even how much should we, but like, let's say you were an outsider how much are you comfortable with me suffering before you say, oh, well, now you've suffered enough that I can take action? That's a part of my French, but it's a BS question, right? Like, nobody should suffer any abuse, right?
That's right.
But it's packaged like, well, hey, at least you're not getting, the same kind of stuff you were getting 20 years ago. Well, how much should we get, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Give me a number.
Well, what is it? The arc of justice is long, and that's that kind of thinking that you can point to any kind of social justice issue and be like, well, things were better than they were then. It's like, why are you still complaining? Like, the whole slavery was 100 years ago. Well, actually, if you count. There's that loophole in the 13th Amendment. It's actually slavery is still legal in America. All right, that kind of getting off track here, but we're about at the end of the show. But I want to make sure, just if there's anything else you wanted to say before we ended up wrapping up, just talking about yourself or just issues in the community.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about this, because I think it's just something that needs to stay in the consciousness. Because again, there's this perception that there's a lot of gains being made, but people have to be aware, right? Like, just because we're quote unquote more visible, or these issues are out in the open, we're really far from getting them resolved. I think though that the conflict emerging is like good in that now these issues can get out in the open and get talked about, but it's exhausting to have to talk about them constantly just to sort of go through the day. The other thing I'd like to say, is I understand too that not everybody that follows a certain faith has those sort of views, right? But again, this is where we need other people in our lives to be microphones and to help us, navigate these issues as well. But again, just thanks for giving me the platform today to kind of answer those questions and talk through this issue. And I do want to say that we always do maintain a safe, we do our best to maintain a safe space for people in the family or people that are questioning or still in that process, so if anybody does need to talk to somebody that's older, or just needs to check in, they can always stop by and ask for Miranda or ask for Frankie, and even if we don't have a lot of time, we would at least talk to them or try to at least provide that kind of a space. So hopefully, we're an example to people that you can be in the community and be visible and navigate these issues, and I just hope that that's maybe a takeaway as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Miranda, and telling your story and having this really great discussion about it. Want to thank everybody for tuning in to the show today. As always, if you want to listen to it later or, remind your friends to listen to it, you can find our episodes on YouTube, and we also have a Facebook page, the Hoodrat Strategist radio program. Once again, Cosecha is going to be having a rally/vigil over at the county jail at 8:30 p.m. tonight, and every week until August 7th, when the resolution is up for a vote to basically non-cooperate with ICE here in Kalamazoo. So, once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. And as always, keep on fighting for that revolution solution.